With its proven World War II track record, the U.S. M1 helmet continued to serve in various configurations with the U.S. military in both the Korean conflict and the Vietnam War. In fact, the U.S. M1 had a 40-year span of service. From the end of World War II until the start of the Korean War, very little was done in the way of upgrades to the M1 helmet. With over 22 million M1 steel shells produced, there wasn't much need to produce additional helmets. Essentially, the U.S. military repaired and recycled millions of helmets over the next decades. While many of the M1 helmets worn in Korea were still in their original World War II configuration, repainting and repair was common. After World War II, many different tints of olive drab were used, and often helmets were repainted in the field with whatever color was at hand. Often fine sand or silica gel was used for texture rather than cork. Consequently, Korean War-era configured M1 helmets can be found in many different color shades, but the most typical have dark, semi-gloss appearance. Since the end of World War II, the biggest changes to the M1 steel shell were to improve the chin strap. This included the T1 chin strap clamp, which was now used to attach the strap to the helmet rather than by sewing it on. This made repairs to the chin strap far easier. Also, the T1 chin strap release clip was made standard on the M1 helmet and retrofitted to almost all M1 helmets. The chin strap itself was changed from khaki webbing to the now standard olive drab number 7. While few, if any, steel M1 shells were produced after World War II, there's no doubt M1 liners were manufactured. Like the chin strap, the biggest change to the liner was the adoption of olive drab number 7, replacing khaki as the color for the suspension. The suspension webbing was still made from a herringbone twill design, as it was in World War II. After World War II, the use of the term M1C to describe an airborne helmet was discontinued, and helmets were now described as either infantry or parachutist. The Korean-era parachutist helmet shell was identical to the infantry shell, with the exception that the chin strap had the additional airborne tab which was snapped into the liner. The Korean-era parachutist liner was nearly identical to the World War II liner, except the suspension color was now olive drab number 7, and the A-frame webbing used for the chin strap was now independently riveted to the body and was not beneath the headband suspension as they were in World War II. As with World War II, the U.S. Marines continued the tradition of wearing their M1 combat helmets with camouflage helmet covers. These covers were essentially identical to the World War II second pattern. Unlike World War II, it was very common to see these covers with the Marine Corps' famous Eagle, Globe, and Anchor insignia stenciled on the front. Army personnel occasionally wore camouflaged helmet covers, but these were usually scraps of camouflage parachute or covers liberated from Marines. The late 50s and early 60s often saw creative field-made examples of helmet covers, such as this field-made cover made from a piece of a U.S. Marine Corps utility uniform. When the Korean War ended in 1953, U.S. helmet designers continued to try to improve the functionality of helmets. This modified M1 helmet was the basis for testing a radio helmet. It featured a battery system attached to the rear of the helmet and an antenna attached to the crown. This evolved to a helmet called the AN/PRC-34X1, an experimental helmet radio made from a heavy composite material similar to that used in helmet liners. The helmet used a parachutist-style chin strap assembly with a battery and a two-way radio system installed inside the helmet. There is no steel shell for the AN/PRC-34X1 due to the antenna. The idea of a helmet-borne radio system later evolved to the AN/PRC-36X1. The battery of this helmet was carried on a soldier's belt, while the radio, antenna, and speakers were attached to the helmet. In the late 1950s, several changes were made to the M1 combat helmet liner. The material used in the suspension changed from the dark herringbone twill weave to a thicker cotton weave that was a lighter shade of green. In addition, the insignia eyelet punched in the front of the helmet was discontinued. As the U.S. became more entrenched and involved in attempting to stem the spread of communism in Vietnam, the M1 helmet remained the main battle helmet of U.S. forces from all branches of service. A new helmet cover was developed by the Army's Experimental Research and Development Laboratory, was adopted by all branches of the military. The cover was reversible, with one side being a green leaf-like pattern and the reverse tan and brown circular patterns. It was often referred to as the Mitchell pattern, but no one really seems to know why. The covers were held in place by a neoprene band. In 1961, the material used in making helmet liners was changed to nylon. The interior of the liners now had an orange and green appearance. In approximately 1965, the original Riddell suspension configuration had also evolved. No longer was there a center tie, but now 3 crossing strips of cotton served as the primary suspension. Unlike the liners of World War II and Korea, the entire suspension could be removed from the liner shell. The liner also had 3 small buckles riveted to it. These held a new neckband in place. In the 1960s, it was very common for U.S. military forces to have painted helmet liners designating specialty career fields or ceremonial units. This is evidenced by these 2 U.S. Air Force Security Police painted liners. The Mitchell pattern helmet cover wasn't the only helmet cover used by U.S. forces. Occasionally, forces used a tiger stripe pattern. In 1973, a new helmet cover was also designed. This was the Woodland camouflage pattern and was not reversible. This design saw limited use in the Vietnam War. The 1970s and 80s saw the M1 helmet's steel shell remain unchanged since World War II, except for its color and texture. The liner and the chin strap systems, however, continued to change and evolve. Snaps and webbed chin cups replaced T1 connectors, and eventually nylon replaced all the cotton webbing in the chin straps. In the 1980s, a thicker type of nylon was used to manufacture the liners. The result was an iguana green interior. These were the final versions of the M1 liner, and strangely, they seemed to be the worst made as they often didn't fit well into the helmets and they weren't symmetrical. The final airborne version of the M1 was made of the same material and continued to rely on an A-frame webbing for its chin strap. From its humble beginning in World War II until the late 1980s, the M1 helmet served America's combat forces for 5 decades. The number of lives it saved can only be imagined. It remains one of the finest and most copied pieces of individual combat equipment ever produced.